Death Row was fun while it lasted. It was what it was, but it was more negative than positive. And right now I'm surrounding myself with positivity, so.
Death Row Records made Snoop Dogg a superstar, but behind the fame was a nightmare he never dared to speak about. For years, he stayed silent, trapped between loyalty and survival. Now Snoop is finally breaking that silence, and the truth about Death Row is darker than anyone imagined. To understand why Snoop's journey with Death Row Records matters, we have to rewind to the early 1990s, a moment when hip-hop wasn't just evolving, it was exploding. Death Row Records wasn't just another label, it was a cultural earthquake. Founded in 1991 by Dr. Dre, Suge Knight, the DOC, and Dick Griffey, the label brought together business muscle, street credibility, and unmatched musical talent. Dr. Dre's The Chronic dropped in 1992 and completely shifted the landscape of rap. It introduced G-Funk, smooth synths layered over hard-hitting bass lines, with beats that felt both laid-back and dangerous. That sound didn't just define West Coast hip-hop, it rewired mainstream music. Overnight, rap became the voice of the streets and the soundtrack of America. Then came Snoop. His 1993 debut Doggy Style wasn't just a hit, it was history in the making. Selling over 800,000 copies in its first week, it became the fastest-selling debut album ever at the time. Critics hailed him as the natural heir to Dre's throne, while fans connected instantly with his effortless flow and magnetic personality. And the empire only grew. In 1995, Tupac Shakur signed to Death Row after Suge Knight famously bailed him out of prison. With All Eyes on Me, Tupac delivered the first double-disc rap album to go multi-platinum, turning Death Row into a dynasty. For a moment in time, the label had Dre, Snoop, and Tupac, the holy trinity of West Coast hip-hop, under one roof. From the outside, it looked unstoppable. Death Row had money, power, and influence that rivaled entire industries. But behind the platinum plaques and chart-topping singles, the label was imploding. Stories of intimidation, gang ties, and violent clashes turned boardrooms into battleground. As one fan later wrote on Reddit, Death Row wasn't just a label, it was like watching The Sopranos, but with platinum records. Every hit had a body behind it. The empire wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly. At the center of this storm was Calvin Broadus Jr., better known to the world as Snoop Doggy Dogg. Snoop wasn't just another rapper with Dre's cosign, he was the West Coast. His smooth delivery, laid-back charisma, and cool, but deadly aura made him a cultural icon almost overnight. But the same street authenticity that fueled his music also placed him in real danger. In 1993, at the height of his fame, Snoop was charged with murder in connection with the shooting death of Philip Wilder-Merriam, a reputed gang member. Suddenly, the rising star who had just made history with Doggy Style wasn't just topping charts, he was fighting for his life in court. The trial became a media spectacle. Paparazzi swarmed him as he walked into the courtroom in tailored suits, cameras flashing, while headlines screamed about hip-hop's brightest star facing a potential life sentence. To fans, it was unthinkable. Their hero, the man who brought them gin and juice, could be lost forever. For nearly 3 years, the case loomed over him like a shadow. Every performance, every public appearance, every studio session was haunted by the possibility that his career and his freedom could end in an instant. When the acquittal finally came in 1996, it felt like the entire hip-hop community exhaled at once. But for Snoop, the trial left scars. In later interviews, he admitted, "I was young, I was a star, but I was also in the middle of some real life or death situations." Death Row was bigger than music, it was survival. That case marked a turning point. Even though Snoop walked out of the courtroom a free man, he realized something chilling. Fame couldn't shield him, and success couldn't protect him. Death Row wasn't just a label anymore, it was a battlefield. And Snoop knew his next moves would determine whether he stayed alive long enough to enjoy the empire he helped build. On the surface, Death Row Records looked untouchable, like a dynasty built to last forever. The label was dominating the Billboard charts, pumping out multi-platinum albums, and redefining West Coast rap culture. Dr. Dre's The Chronic had set the blueprint. Snoop Dogg's Doggy Style became the fastest-selling debut album in history at the time. Tupac's All Eyes on Me was an instant classic. From the outside, it was all Bentleys, mansion parties, and music that felt larger than life. But behind those platinum plaques, the empire was quietly starting to crack. At the center of it all stood Suge Knight. To the industry, he was a ruthless visionary, a man who turned Death Row into the most feared and respected label in hip-hop. But inside the camp, Suge's leadership style was built on intimidation. Former employees and artists have spoken about backroom beatdowns, threats of violence, and deals that left artists feeling trapped. The label was less a creative sanctuary and more like a kingdom ruled by fear. For Snoop Dogg, the pressure was even heavier. In 1996, he had just beaten a high-profile murder case, a trial that could have ended not just his career, but his life. After walking free, he wanted peace. He wanted space to grow as an artist and as a man. Instead, he found himself right back in the middle of chaos, surrounded by the same energy he thought he had escaped in court. And from the outside, people asked, why would Snoop even think about leaving? He had fame, fortune, and the most powerful rap label in the world behind him. But the truth was darker. At death row, every success came with a price. Loyalty wasn't just expected, it was enforced. Silence wasn't optional, it was survival. As the East Coast-West Coast rivalry spiraled into open hostility, those cracks inside death row widened into dangerous fault lines. Tupac's fiery energy only added fuel to the storm. Violence, paranoia, and distrust became part of daily life. And Snoop? He wasn't just a bystander. He was in the middle of it, all caught between loyalty to his label, love for his craft, and the instinct to survive a storm that could easily take his life. Suge Knight wasn't just running Death Row Records, he was ruling it like a kingdom. At its height, Death Row was more than a label. It was an empire with Suge seated firmly on the throne. Lavish parties filled with celebrities and endless luxury showcased the success. But beneath the glamour, his reputation carried a weight that could silence a room. Suge was a man you respected, but more importantly, a man you feared. His word wasn't advice, it was law. Inside Death Row's offices, the atmosphere mirrored the streets. High stakes, constant tension, and an unspoken reminder that loyalty was enforced, not requested. Stories of intimidation, late-night confrontations, and violent displays of power weren't rumors, they were part of the culture that kept Suge untouchable. For Snoop Dogg, this script soon felt like a prison. After surviving the most harrowing chapter of his life, a murder trial that could have ended everything, he was desperate for peace, space to breathe, and room to grow as both an artist and a man. But death row wasn't designed for peace. Its foundation was built on chaos, aggression, and raw dominance. Snoop himself would later put it bluntly in interviews. I felt like I had traded one danger for another. I was free from the courtroom, but I was still trapped. Those words cut deep because they revealed a reality many fans never saw. On the surface, he had fame, wealth, and a legendary label behind him. Behind closed doors, he was living in fear, bound to a machine that thrived on pressure and control. And just as the walls around him were closing in, the East Coast-West Coast feud erupted, tightening Suge's grip even further and dragging Snoop into a storm bigger than anything he'd faced before. By the mid-90s, hip-hop was no longer just about beats and rhymes, it had become a battlefield. On the East Coast stood Bad Boy Records, led by Puff Daddy and the notorious B.I.G. On the West Coast, Death Row Records reigned with Suge Knight, Tupac Shakur, and Snoop Dogg carrying the flag. What started as playful competition quickly spiraled into open hostility. Diss tracks turned into public insults. Magazine covers, MTV interviews, and radio stations fanned the flames. Even fans began taking sides, repping East or West, as if it were more than music, as if it were life or death. For Tupac, it was all or nothing. After being shot in New York and convinced Bad Boy had a hand in it, he went all in on war. His records were filled with venom, his interviews dripping with rage. Tupac didn't just rap about beef, he lived it. But here's the twist. Not everyone at Death Row shared his fire. Snoop Dogg, despite riding under the Death Row banner, didn't see Biggie or Puff as his enemies. Behind the scenes, Snoop and Biggie had respect for one another. They weren't friends, but they weren't enemies either. And for Snoop, that mattered. That difference in perspective put Snoop in an impossible position. On one side, he had Tupac and Suge, who expected complete loyalty and saw peace as weakness. On the other hand, he had his own conscience, telling him the feud wasn't worth the blood being spilt. In the world of Death Row, though, neutrality wasn't an option. To stand apart was to risk being labeled a traitor. As one fan later wrote on a hip-hop blog, Pac wanted war, Snoop wanted peace, and in Death Row, peace wasn't an option. By 1996, Death Row Records was on top of the world, but behind the scenes, cracks were forming. The tension finally boiled over after a now-famous interview on Hot 97. Snoop Dogg, speaking openly, said he had no issues with Biggie or Puff Daddy. For most rappers, it would have been just another comment, but inside the firestorm of the East versus West feud, those words carried weight. For Tupac and Suge Knight, that wasn't neutrality, it was betrayal. To them, loyalty meant war. If Death Row had enemies, then everyone on the roster was expected to stand on the front lines. And for Snoop to publicly distance himself from the feud felt like crossing a line. When he returned to Los Angeles, Snoop immediately felt the shift. The same label that once embraced him as family now treated him like an outsider. The love, the brotherhood, the energy that made Death Row feel unstoppable, all of it had turned cold. He later admitted in interviews, "When I came back, it was different. The love wasn't the same. I could feel it. It was a dangerous place to be." Snoop wasn't just dealing with hurt feelings. In Death Row's world, a fracture in trust could mean more than career trouble. It could mean survival. The whispers, the stares, the isolation, they all sent a message. He was no longer fully protected. And then, as the walls were closing in on Snoop, tragedy struck. Tupac Shakur was gunned down in Las Vegas, sending shockwaves through the culture and accelerating the unraveling of Death Row itself. For Snoop, the fallout with Pac wasn't just personal. It was the beginning of an end that would change hip-hop forever. September 7, 1996, Las Vegas. After leaving the MGM Grand, where Mike Tyson had just knocked out Bruce Seldon, Tupac Shakur rode in Suge Knight's BMW. On that strip, under the neon lights, history took a tragic turn. A white Cadillac pulled up alongside them, and in a barrage of bullets, Tupac was hit 4 times. 6 days later, at just 25 years old, the world lost not only one of hip-hop's greatest voices, but one of its fiercest spirits. The news sent shockwaves across the globe. For millions of fans, it felt impossible to believe. Tupac wasn't just a rapper, he was a poet, an activist, and a cultural lightning rod whose words gave voice to the voiceless. His death wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was proof that the East versus West feud had spiraled beyond music. Beyond disses, it had spilt into real bloodshed. For Death Row Records, Tupac's death marked the beginning of the end. The label had built its empire on raw energy, star power, and fearlessness. But without its brightest star, the shine began to fade. Dr. Dre had already walked away months earlier, tired of the constant chaos. And now, with Pac gone, the dynasty that once seemed unstoppable suddenly looked fragile. Inside Death Row, paranoia set in. What was once the hottest label in hip-hop began to feel more like a war zone. As one fan wrote on Reddit years later, after Pac died, Death Row was like a haunted house. Everyone was looking over their shoulder. Nobody trusted nobody. Snoop Dogg was still there, but the trust between him and Suge Knight had cracked wide open. Suge's controlling grip, the threats, the unpredictable violence, it all became too much. Snoop realized what many whispered but were too afraid to say. If he stayed, he might not survive. Tupac's death wasn't just the loss of a man, it was the death of an era, the moment when the dream of Death Row turned into its darkest nightmare. By the late 90s, the empire that was Death Row Records was crumbling from within. The same label that once dominated the charts and defined West Coast hip-hop was unraveling under the weight of chaos. Suge Knight, the man who ruled it with an iron fist, was now behind bars. Dr. Dre, the architect of its sound, had already broken away to build Aftermath, shaping a new legacy that would soon introduce the world to Eminem and 50 Cent. And Tupac, the label's brightest star, was gone, his death leaving a hole not just in Death Row, but in hip-hop itself. That left Snoop Dogg standing in the middle of the wreckage, trapped in a place that no longer felt like home. The label that had given him his rise was now a ghost of itself, filled with uncertainty, danger, and decline. Snoop would later reflect on that period with raw honesty. "I felt like I was surviving, not living. I had to get out." And so, in 1998, Snoop Dogg made the boldest and riskiest decision of his career. He walked away from Death Row. He chose to sign with Master P's No Limit Records, a southern powerhouse reshaping the industry from New Orleans. To many fans, the move looked like a gamble. Why would the West Coast golden child leave the label that made him a household name for something so different, so far from home? But for Snoop, it wasn't about labels or regional pride, it was about survival. No Limit offered more than a contract. It offered safety, creative freedom, and a fresh start. That decision marked not just a career shift, but a reinvention. For the first time in years, Snoop wasn't just surviving, he was free. When Snoop Dogg signed with Master P's No Limit Records in 1998, it was more than a business move, it was a lifeline. Death Row had nearly consumed him, and many doubted whether he could thrive outside of Suge Knight's shadow. But No Limit gave Snoop exactly what he needed: freedom, stability, and the space to reinvent himself. His first release under the label, Day Game Is to Be Sold, Not to Be Told, made a clear statement. Snoop wasn't just the product of Death Row's machine, he was a star in his own right. The album debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, proving he could succeed without the drama and chaos of his past. From there, Snoop began to evolve. He experimented with funk, soul, and laid-back party anthems that carried echoes of George Clinton and the West Coast G-Funk sound he helped pioneer. He leaned into collaborations, crossing over into pop, R, B, and even reggae years later. His music stopped being confined to gangsta rap. It became a soundtrack for good times, smoke-filled rooms, and cultural connection. But his evolution didn't stop with music. Snoop transformed into a global brand. He became a TV personality, an actor, a coach for youth football, a businessman, and eventually even a cookbook co-author alongside Martha Stewart. Each reinvention added new layers to his persona while keeping his Long Beach authenticity intact. And that's the heart of Snoop's story, his ability to adapt. In an industry where so many of his peers were lost to violence, incarceration, or the grind of fading relevance, Snoop found ways not only to survive, but thrive. He shifted with the times without losing himself. From death row's chaos to No Limit's rebirth, from gangster rap to cultural icon, Snoop Dogg proved that reinvention is survival. And in doing so, he became more than a rapper. He became a legend, loved by generations. But here's the plot twist no one ever saw coming. In February 2022, 3 decades after first signing that fateful contract and years after walking away for survival, Snoop Dogg shocked the world. He bought Death Row Records. Yes, the same label that once trapped him, betrayed him, and nearly broke him was now in his hands. Pause and let that sink in. For years, Death Row had been a symbol of both triumph and trauma in hip-hop history. To Snoop, it was the place that gave him his start, but also the cage that nearly ended him. And yet, here he was, no longer the rookie rapper fighting for space, but the seasoned dogfather reclaiming the throne. This wasn't just a business move, it was poetic justice, a story of survival turning into ownership. In his announcement, Snoop put it simply but powerfully. Death Row is back in the hands of the Dogfather. Fans felt the weight of that moment instantly. Social media lit up with reactions, many pointing out the almost cinematic nature of his journey. One fan tweeted what millions were thinking: Snoop went from Death Row's soldier to Death Row's king. That's legacy. But it goes deeper than legacy. By reclaiming Death Row, Snoop also gave new meaning to its name. No longer a house of fear and chaos, he began reimagining it as a platform for creativity, independence, and cultural preservation. He even moved to bring Death Row into the digital era, expanding it into NFTs and streaming platforms, ensuring that the music and the history would never be forgotten. Snoop's story had come full circle. From being trapped in Death Row's shadow to owning its future, he didn't just survive, he conquered. Today, Snoop Dogg stands as one of the last true giants of that golden era. He's more than just a rapper, he's a cultural icon, a businessman, an actor, and even a household name recognized across generations. From the Super Bowl stage to children's shows, he's transcended the genre while never losing the essence of what made him. But behind the fame lies a story that reads almost like a novel, a tale of loyalty, betrayal, survival, and reinvention. The saga of Death Row Records wasn't just about making hit records. It was about power, identity, and the dangerous cost of success in an era when hip-hop wasn't just music, it was life or death. And right in the middle of that storm stood Snoop Dogg, a young artist caught between brilliance and chaos, loyalty and survival. He watched friends become legends, rivals become enemies, and a label once on top of the world spiral into collapse. Yet somehow, through it all, he endured. His journey is proof that even when the system tries to break you, even when your environment is built to cage you, you can take control of your story. Snoop went from the streets of Long Beach to the courtroom battles and paranoia of Death Row to global superstardom with No Limit, and finally, to reclaim the very empire that once nearly destroyed him. That's not just survival, that's transformation. Snoop Dogg's legacy is now more than music, it's a blueprint, a reminder that resilience, patience, and reinvention can turn scars into crowns. As fans look back on the Death Row saga, one truth remains. Snoop didn't just escape his past, he mastered it. He flipped pain into power and made history on his own terms. And that's the ultimate lesson. No matter how dark the storm gets, your story isn't over until you take the pen back in your own hands. And here's the wild part. Snoop didn't just survive Death Row, he came back decades later and bought it. The same label that nearly crushed him is now stamped with his signature. But here's the question, was that move pure business genius, or was it revenge wrapped in redemption? I want to hear your take. Drop your theory in the comments. Because this saga isn't just about music, it's about power, loyalty, and survival. And trust me, if you think this was the ending, you might be wrong. The deeper you look into Death Row's story, the more the plot twists. Stick around. The next chapter could change how you see the entire West Coast legacy.